Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I wanted to talk with you really quickly about a piece of punctuation that's a little strange. It's the kind of thing that students don't really ever use on purpose, and it's the em dash. An em dash is what you get when you type in hyphen hyphen or dash dash on your keyboard, and it autocorrects that one longer kind of dash. So what the ACT expects you to know about this thing is that it has two uses, and I'm about to hop over to the iPad to explain both with some examples, but here are the two uses broken down very quickly. First of all, it's used to combine independent clauses, and we've maybe mentioned this before in a previous video about the semicolon, and I'll link to that below. But an independent clause is just a phrase or a clause that has subject and a verb and subject-verb agreement, and it can stand alone as a sentence. And so sometimes we want to combine two independent clauses into one more complex sentence. Well, one way to do that is just by putting an em dash right between these two independent clauses, and I'll show you that here in a second. But the second way to use em dashes that the ACT expects you to know is like you would use parentheses. So parentheses are used to set off non-essential information from the main part of a sentence, and the only time you would ever use two em dashes in one sentence is to do the same thing. So let's hop on over to that iPad and look at a couple of examples. Okay, as I just mentioned, there are really two ways to use an em dash. And again, an em dash is like when you on your keyboard, you hit hyphen hyphen and it autocorrects that one long dash. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to look like a sad face, but now I'm just going to kind of go with it. Okay, but that's what happens. That's an em dash, is this longer kind of dash like you see right here. And the ACT is going to expect that you know how to use it in two different ways. The first way, like I mentioned, is to combine independent clauses. Again, an independent clause is a sentence or a clause that can stand alone as a sentence. So if you look at this first example right here, it says, "My cousin threw the water balloon at me as hard as he could. I dodged it." Well, the first part of that sentence, "My cousin threw the water balloon at me as hard as he could," that's an independent clause. We could, if we wanted to, just put a period here, right? And then we'd have two sentences, but we're dealing with em dashes, so we're not going to do that. And then, of course, the phrase "I dodged it" is also an independent clause. It doesn't matter how long or short they are. I purposely used a longer independent clause in the first half of the sentence and a shorter one in the second. The length doesn't matter. What matters is grammatically, what does this piece of punctuation do? Well, like we just said, after the word could, right here, we could put a long em dash, and that would combine these two independent clauses into one more complex sentence. One temptation for students that they often have is to put a fanboys conjunction after an em dash. Fanboys conjunctions are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, and they're used after a comma in this situation. But you might see these two sentences and think, well, we could put the word but right here, huh? So, "My cousin threw the water balloon at me as hard as he could, but I dodged it." But you can't do that. You could do that if you put a comma there instead of an em dash, but because we're just using the em dash, we know that we don't need a fanboys conjunction. So just the em dash, "My cousin threw the water balloon at me as hard as he could," em dash, "I dodged it." And that's one of the two ways the ACT expects you to know how to use this piece of punctuation. The second way is the same way that you would use parentheses. Technically speaking, we would call this setting off a non-essential piece of information or a non-essential clause. But to me, the easiest way to teach this is just to think, if I could put parentheses here, then maybe I could put em dashes here, and that's totally true. So check out this first example that I have right here. It says, "Scrabble, not Monopoly, is my favorite board game." So we're going to need some kind of punctuation around this phrase, "not Monopoly." As you could see, if we put parentheses here like this sentence would flow and work just fine, right? Because the phrase "not Monopoly" is what's called non-essential. It's kind of disruptive from the flow of the sentence, of the independent clause of the sentence. And so instead of parentheses, what we can do is put two em dashes here, just like that. "Scrabble, not Monopoly, is my favorite board game." The reason I put this second example down here is to show you a way that the ACT likes to ask questions about em dashes so you can see how to think about it. So what they'll do is they'll have a sentence like this: "I think of my grandmother, em dash, a great cook if there ever was one, every time I bake." And what they'll have underlined is probably something like this part right here, okay? Going over where you have that comma after the word one. And so what you, the student, have to do is realize that this em dash up here, this top one after the word grandmother, isn't going anywhere, right? It's not an option for us if this part down here is underlined. It's not an option for us to get rid of that first em dash. So that means we have to think about it like this. Well, If I'm going to have just one em dash in the sentence, like we talked about at the very beginning, it's going to be used to combine independent clauses. So then I have to think about these two sentences, if you will, what comes before and after the em dash, and see if they're independent clauses. So before it says, I think of my grandmother, and technically that's an independent clause, but it's a strange one. It's not really a complete thought. And then after it says, a great cook if there ever was one every time I bake. That's definitely not an independent clause. So this em dash at the beginning after the word grandmother is not being used to combine two independent clauses. And because it can't be moved in the sentence, I can't get rid of it because it's not underlined. It's not an option for me. That must mean that this piece of punctuation over here, this comma, is inappropriate. What this is doing, of course, is using em dashes like parentheses. And so if the first one is permanent, if it's not being used to combine independent clauses, then it must be being used like parentheses. And that's why the option that would be correct would be the one that gets rid of this comma and replaces it with a long em dash right there. I think of my grandmother, a great cook if there ever was one. That's a non-essential clause, if you will, every time I bake. Okay, so there you have it. Don't let the em dash be this mysterious piece of punctuation that you don't know how to use. Again, in English, punctuation has deliberate uses. They're not just thrown into sentences willy-nilly whenever somebody just kind of feels like needing a pause in a sentence or something like that. So one thing that I've done is put together some ACT cheat sheets that break down each of these pieces of punctuation, as well as what you need to know for math, reading, and science, into one compressed document for your quick reference whenever you might need it. So check out the actsystem.com/cheat, and you'll find there a way to download those cheat sheets for free. Thanks a lot, and God bless.